Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com. Our guest today is Dato Siobhan Das, who is the CEO of the American Malaysian Chamber of Commerce, AmCham. We'll start our conversation talking through some of the recent developments, including the US-Malaysia reciprocal tariff agreement and the Malaysia-ASEAN chairmanship that's been concluded. Stay tuned as we go through a number of other forthcoming developments, including geoeconomic challenges posed by US-China competition and some of the future prospects for Southeast Asia's economic story. So welcome to the podcast, Siobhan. And let's start with the elephant in the room, which is the US-Malaysia trade deal. We've heard all kinds of things about, pockets of domestic criticism on sovereignty and so on. My understanding talking to officials is that they went into this with eyes wide open, and they had to kind of weigh all of these considerations against the fact that this was a U.S. administration that was taking a pretty tough line on these issues. And there was also a preference for Malaysia being a relatively speaking first mover, leveraging the ASEAN Summit and the fact that President Trump was going to be in Malaysia, and also getting past this notion that Malaysia was kind of being left behind in some of the big strategic decisions in U.S. policy, being a trusted partner, for example, in some of these key sectors. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but also more broadly, what does this also mean for companies? There's a lot of talk about challenges, but what does it mean in terms of the opportunities for companies that are looking at this US-Malaysia relationship more broadly?
Thank you very much for having me on and for asking AmCham to come to talk on this, Prashant. Great to see you again as well. So thank you. This is a really interesting time, and you're right on all the things that you said there. It was a very interesting negotiation. It's not your typical FTA. It came to being because of the tariffs that the Trump administration was putting on across the globe. It's not just Malaysia, it's right across the globe, and everybody is impacted. And I think everybody was trying to figure out what is it that we needed to do to be able to still engage with the United States. The United States is the world's largest consumer market. It is one of the trading partner for a number of different countries and an important trading partner. And Malaysia is no different. Malaysia, a significant trading partner for Malaysia. I think it's the number two trading partner, and the US is the number one investor in Malaysia. So this was a critical agreement to be able to come to. And there's a lot of US businesses that have landed in Malaysia over the last 50 years. We represent a host of those, and we've seen that grow over the last 50 years. A very significant number of them are in the semiconductor field. So this is it was very important for Malaysia to kind of understand what that market was to its economy. And I think you're absolutely right. I think Malaysia did take a very pragmatic and very practical look at what they needed to do to maintain that market. This is not to the exclusion of any other market, but it's with the significance that it has, the American market has to the driver of its economy. It had to really think about it and say, okay, what is it that we need to do to preserve the drivers of our economy, the goals that we've already set through in the NIMP, the National Investment Master Plans, and how do we achieve those goals? How do we, if we don't make this deal, how does that set back our own growth? How does this set back what we want to achieve as a country, in terms of moving up the value chain, in terms of quality jobs for our people? So I think the ministry really needed, and the country needed to look at how does this agreement shape what our future is. But again, this is not to the exclusion of any other country, because I think Malaysia, rightfully so, has to diversify its markets. And it's matured enough over the years to be a leader and an innovative leader in the region. And it is going out slowly into different markets. And I think that's great to see. And we're all excited that a lot of the investments that are coming into Malaysia are actually using Malaysia as a base to leapfrog or enter different markets that the Malaysia provides. I think Malaysia has 9 FTAs, and that provides a very attractive base for a lot of US companies to come to Malaysia. So I think, the opportunity to get this right was really powering behind what the negotiators were looking for to try and find a deal that could balance what they need to move forward with. So I think the approach by MITI was correct to look at that balance.
Right. And just to follow up on that really quickly, because I agree with a lot of what you said there in terms of Malaysia's calculations. One of the other aspects that I think was maybe a little bit missed amid the focus on the trade aspect was the fact that we also had technically an elevation of the US-Malaysia relationship to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's the first upgrade that we've seen for a Southeast Asian country under the second Trump administration. And I think the skeptics who thought maybe a year ago that actually the relationship was, particularly if you look at the start of the Gaza war, it was not doing well in terms of the optics. And there was actually some of the domestic dynamics that were getting quite complicated. So the fact that Malaysia has been able to execute some of these dynamics here to get to an upgrade, I think is a bit of a missed point. I'm just wondering, because I think you've sort of talked about this publicly a little bit, about the fact that the intra-regional competition in Southeast Asia for investments and such has actually been increasing over the past few years. And so for Malaysia to get on the map and stay on the map in terms of the United States and the investment landscape, it also needs to do a bit more. So do you think that this upgrade, above and beyond the sort of symbolic optic components, also does help Malaysia kind of position itself a little bit more on the map? Because I think for a while, like I was saying, in terms of US policy, Malaysia wasn't really in the sort of top tier of partners. It was kind of there and abouts. But is that also, you think, a bit of an accomplishment here for the Malaysian government?
I think so. I think there's a lot that's happened in the last few months that has raised Malaysia's profile. I think also there's been a lot of understated role that Malaysia has played. I think we just haven't given it the recognition that it actually exists. And I think this is where the strength is. I think that both sides were at pains to really understand what was valuable in the relationship. And I think when they actually studied what was there, they came to the conclusion that, yes, there's still work to be done, but fundamentally there is a level of trust and compliance that can be worked on and upgraded. And I think that's where the relationship is pointing towards. Malaysia has the potential and is already a trusted partner. It's got the rules and regulations and its proven ability to play to global rules, to play to the needs of a monitored environment. It has all the foundations there, and it's playing within those rules. So I think it's really establishing the trust and establishing making it more visible that there is that relationship. Whether it is, and this is not an area that we get into, but the security relationship between the US and Malaysia is quite strong. But the commercial relationship and the strength of that commercial relationship with the commercial law that's in place, the strength of the IP laws. Yes, like I said, I'm not going to say that it's perfect, but there's work to be done. We can improve the transparency. We can improve our traceability, and I think that's what the relationships and the acts and the agreements that have come to place will support. I think that's what people are excited about, in the sense that, okay, we have now clarity. Businesses now know, okay, we're at 19% on certain things, but they're in various sectors that are important to the relationship. Those sectors have been given a different level of tariffs that can keep it competitive for the US business, because a lot of that Malaysian business that does go back to the United States is important to the US value chain. A lot of the businesses that are based here also supply the rest of the world. So, that one is less concern, but nonetheless, once you're complying to the United States needs, you're going to be compliant to a lot of the international standards as well. So I think it's a general look, but this is nothing new. Malaysia's already been doing this. It's already compliant. It's already shown its ability to be in that global value chain. And it's not looked at and regarded to as an emerging market or a third world market. The US businesses that are here use and look at operations that are based here as first world. And they're once they're qualified, once a Malaysian organization or a company is qualified to work with a US company, you're qualified globally. So this is the strength of what Malaysian companies can actually do. And I think this is really important because what the agreements do is elevate Malaysian companies to be able to get plugged into the US ecosystem. And by doing that, they become globally recognized as well. So they become much more competitive, not just in the region, not just to the United States, but also globally. And I think that's where the true value for not just US companies, but anybody plugged into that ecosystem, and therefore it gives the opportunity for Malaysian companies to decide whether or not the United States is a marketplace it wants to go to. And if it's excited about it, then there's a pathway. This is what you need to do. If it doesn't want to play in that marketplace, then that's a choice it has to have. But without these agreements, Malaysia may or may not have had that choice. So I think this is a really an opportunity for Malaysian companies to make some really interesting decisions about how they want to innovate, how they want to grow.
Right. And just zooming out a little bit, Malaysia also just chaired ASEAN this year. And there's a whole host of geoeconomic areas there that I know businesses are looking at more generally with respect to the region and globally. So, artificial intelligence, the Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which I think it's still not, completely concluded. It's still going to be, I think they pushed it out to next year. There's the ASEAN Power Grid. What are some of the sectors, perhaps, that you see as kind of the areas of greatest opportunities for business, not just regionally, but also places where Malaysia can contribute as a country that has played a really important role in some of these areas like semiconductors? And I think actually during the pandemic actually is when perhaps U.S. consumers became more aware of that role in terms of semiconductors and parts, that that Malaysia had such a big role in the global supply chain in that regard.
Absolutely. The semiconductor trade is absolutely vital. And I think this is something that Malaysia can play and does play a really important role with the number of exports. I think the number is that 10% or 11% of all electronics passes through Malaysia in some way, shape, or form. And so it was very important for Malaysia to retain this position, and not just as a assembly test, because it is moving up the value chain and we're getting innovation here. There is design happening here. So, it just gives us security in the fact that there is a marketplace. And so SMEs and even companies that wanting to come here can dedicate that investment to be able to reach that marketplace. So I think semiconductors is going to play a vital role going forward. But flowing on from that, these are other sectors that are going to grow. We're already seeing growth and commitment by medical devices, medical technology that are building up on top of this semiconductor base that has been matured over 50 years. So you're seeing that come. And when medical devices come, there's so many rules and regulations and permits that they have to get here. Once it's in Malaysia, you'd unlikely to see them leave very quickly, because that's hard to get in. And once it's here, and if Malaysia can be the fifth kind of global hub for medical devices, this would be a really important thing for Malaysia, not just for the US trade, but also regionally. And I think that's a really important sector we need to be looking at in medical technology, medical devices, but also in addition, aerospace. And I think aerospace, there's a huge opportunity here, not just in parts, but also in development in different areas. So, of course, MROs, the MRO development here is very important to have, but also you've got companies that are actually innovating and finding homes in the ecosystem in Malaysia, which also can then tap into the ASEAN framework that is there, so we can make sure that the inputs are coming from ASEAN, that we can build the hub that is ASEAN that can provide. And I think that's what's exciting about what happened at ASEAN, is that it was this work on interoperability, this work on regionalization, and how do we use the interconnectivity within ASEAN, with Thailand and Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore. How do we all work together? And I think that's what's really important. I'm really glad that in Malaysia's chairmanship, they really pushed a lot of the interoperability and the regionality. And I think that's what's going to really drive not just Malaysia, but the whole ASEAN coming together and provide opportunities for the rest of the lesser developed ASEAN countries to come into the framework. And then with the digital agreement, as you said, we've got a little bit more ways to go, but there's a lot of commitment towards that, and I think that's something we're making great progress on. And once we can get kind of better data flows, making sure that we have a trusted network across the region, this is all going to play and make sure that ASEAN grows harmoniously and together. And yes, it's going to be, you've got Singapore and Timor-Leste at the extremes, but everybody else in between can actually start to say, well, how do I plug in and look towards that plug-in? And I think that's what's really important, is how do we build it together? And of course, you're going to have interregional competition. Everybody's going to want to have a little get ahead of each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. Competition always is the driver of innovation, and so we're looking forward to it. And I think Malaysia should try to strive and kind of move forward, but also how do we look at areas and how do we plug into each other as well?
Right. And I was going to ask, just following up from that, in some of these conversations, I feel like on supply chains, for example, it's often forgotten that, governments can shape some of these conversations on supply chain movements and such, but ultimately it's going to be the businesses that actually have to do the moving, right? And so to that point, I'm wondering, you talked about some of the opportunities and the sectors there, but from a business perspective, what are some of the top challenges that you see to some of these opportunities in Malaysia, as well as regionally and globally, that you think businesses are facing that perhaps might be a little bit underappreciated from those that look primarily at geopolitics or at governments?
Well, if you take geopolitics and government aside and you start looking at what's really driving business growth, and then you get into the traditional, of course, cost is always going to be king, but it's not always the main reason why people choose a location. So they outweigh, if you look at the risk map, they outweigh a lot of the different aspects. So, access to energy. Access to energy is absolutely critical right now. So if and when the ASEAN power grid can come into being, this is going to give ASEAN a much, much better focus on what it can deliver. So access to renewable energy. So these are really, really important things. Your customer is going to be looking for renewables. How are you going to deliver that? That doesn't mean that you're not going to be using traditional forms. It's how do you plug in renewables? You're also going to be looking at, obviously supply chains are going to be looking in this world right now, where's the tariff? Where's the tariff? What are the limitations of the tariff? Do I put I don't think anybody's leaving countries, but which lines of my product are going to be best suited to be closer to customer? Which ones? And closer to customer doesn't necessarily mean closer to the United States. It could mean my customer is in Asia, so therefore I need to be in Asia. So these are all decisions that businesses need to make. Also inputs. Cost of transporting inputs is going up. You cannot just rely on ships or air traffic sending you those inputs. So if you can develop your local ecosystem, then your costs are going to be managed. So can you develop local inputs? And I think this is where ASEAN has a real opportunity to develop its ability, and its SMEs can get into developing key inputs and being able to have a regional supply chain. And I think this is something that's a promise. Malaysia has increasingly got a fantastic, robust ecosystem that is increasingly being able to provide inputs to the US supply chain and the Western supply chain, and it should be encouraged to do more. And I think the Malaysian government is encouraging its SMEs and its Malaysian businesses to look at how do we plug in to innovate so that it can actually supply into those ecosystems and be part of the trading mechanism. So these are really, and I think this is the Malaysian government is saying, how do we support our SMEs? How do we help them gain access to finance? How do we get them access to capacity building and capability growth? And I think with all the regional work that's been done in ASEAN, in individual countries themselves in supporting SMEs, and with the ART as well, access to finance, access to knowledge that there's a secure market that is there, will give businesses confidence that they can now spend money on training, spend money on investing in new equipment, spend money on innovation and design, so that they can be part of that and not just rely on being a minor input, but actually being part of the innovative cycle. Working with regional teams, being able to to develop regional teams, working with the Thais, working with the Vietnamese, or even the Philippines, or in India or anywhere else, so you can develop that knowledge. And I think that's really interesting. And the more businesses can see, okay, this is what's happening, then those supply chain movements are going to kind of like, okay, how do we shorten and strengthen them? So, but of course, are they going to move? Look, supply chains move all the time. They move more than you think, but it's a cost. It costs to move supply chains. And I think one of the things that we need to be very aware of is the role of people and talent mobility, and how do we increase the ability for people to move so that you can actually share that knowledge, to be able to bring that knowledge across the board, and vice versa. There are centers of excellence across Asia that the United States may need, that maybe the Europeans may need. So how do we showcase what innovation's been done here, and how do we spread it across the world, and vice versa? So talent mobility is going to be absolutely critical, and I think this is something we would like to see how we can impress on businesses. How do we make that easier? So there's lots of challenges. Supply chains, exciting, but we need to be able to keep an eye on what really is core to us and core to the businesses. And each business is going to have a different business model. There's no one size fits all. So governments need to be able to be adaptive enough to understand that each company has a different business model. You cannot use one paintbrush and paint the one patina across and say the industry behaves this way. It doesn't. Everybody has a different business model.
Right. And to the point that you raised earlier was about the calibration that these countries have to make when they're sort of managing relationships with different powers. So if you've got, a relationship with the United States and you've got one with China, a number of other countries, how do you manage that? And I think one of the things that the trade agreement has gotten a lot of focus on is some of the provisions, for example, that focus on, if you're doing X, Y, and Z with another country, that might affect how the United States is going to treat you in certain areas, right? I'm wondering if we could zoom out a little bit from the Malaysia case, but just look at some of the geoeconomic impacts of US-China competition and the pressures that they're exerting on different governments and how they're thinking about the choices that they're making, whether it's US, China, other countries. What are the downstream implications of that for businesses and how they're thinking about the choices that they're making, not just today, but 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line?
Okay.